right? Yeah. So I think the bulk of you have probably looked at, looking to see if realize how a good storyteller can be a good equity research analyst. Well, I think next in line is the first one, which is understanding similarities between cinema and equity research. So probably we'll cover a lot more of, the first one, understanding the similarities. Storytelling, yes. I mean, I think, if you're a good storyteller, you can be a good equity research writer, provided you have the domain skill sets. So I think that comes, but through the webinar, probably we'll touch upon, probably the first part a lot more. But yeah, thanks for this. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so what do these images convey to you, right? So it's a flurry of images. Okay, so these are essentially, yes, all of them are movie posters indeed, right? And more importantly, these are your, your first look posters, right? I mean, you can call it first look, you can call it, glimpse, motion posters. So all of that essentially kind of, fit into this criteria, right? So essentially, they are your first real sneak peek into what the movie is about. Okay, high grossing movies, partly yes. I don't know if all of them are, probably yes, right? But right, obviously these are very popular movies, so I think I'm sure everybody has a connect with these movies, right? But these are essentially your first look, sneak peek, glimpse of a movie, right? Your first view of a movie, and what do they essentially convey, right? So your first look. From a first look, what do you get about the movie? Great, right? So in essence, if I have to look at it, right? So by and large, it kind of gives me three things, right? So one, as you rightly said, the genre of the movie comes to you, right? So it's going to be an action-packed movie. It's going to be a science fiction. It's going to be adventure. It's going to be horror, right? So all of that comes through. You get a sense of the characters, who's going to play the lead characters at least, right? And then you also get a narrative tone, right? Or the theme, right? So as somebody said, right? You get a sense in terms of the tone, right? Some of them are, pretty dark, right? In nature, some, it's dusty, and you kind of get a sense in terms of how the movie is going to look and feel, right? So that's largely what a glimpse or a first look kind of conveys. Now taking this to our research world, right? So what is the equivalent of glimpse in the equity research world? If I have just to draw a parallel between equity research report and movies, right? So what's glimpse in a movie too? What's in the equity research? Okay, the first look of a report. Trend, okay. Yeah, so essentially look at it from a first look perspective, right? So what you get to see in a report first, right? Or a typical person who's actually looking at the report first, the first thing that kind of hits them is typically the report headline, right? Why? Because you directly typically don't have access to the complete report. What you would typically see is something like this, right? So this is a snapshot from Trendline, right? Where you get a sense of list of all the reports, right? So this is specifically by Motilal Oswal, but it could be a combination. It could be one specific company, right? So you can kind of do a slice and dice. So what you see is the company name and a title, company name, title, right? So that's all you see, right? And whatever is interesting, you're going to kind of click and move forward, right? So therefore, the equivalent of a typical first look poster is actually your headline, right? And therefore, it's important for the headline to convey whatever we said a teaser or rather a first look will have to convey, right? So what is that? Genre, right? So for instance, if you look at Zomato, it talks about a target revision, price target revision or the recommendation revision. It's Zomato, right? And when you're looking at lead characters, I mean, you can call the company the lead character, very fair. The other option is to look at what is it that's primarily driving, right? So here it talks about revenue, it talks about growth, right? So in certain cases, it's costs, profitability, and so on, right? So then obviously those become your lead character, right? Because the entire report kind of anchors itself on that particular metric. And then obviously the tone, right? It could be a bullish tone. For instance, Zomato talks about strong growth outlook along with a broad-based delivery, right? It's very bullish. Okay, on the other hand, if you look at Page Industries, it talks about sluggish revenue growth, but efficient cost control measures. Okay, so it's kind of balancing one with the other. So the tone is pretty neutral. Right? And same goes on the other hand, it could be negative, right? So for instance, NOCIL Limited talks about an event update around Chinese dumping, where it says price correction is due to Chinese dumping is going to hurt its performance, right? So it's an event update around Chinese dumping. It's about pricing power as a metric, and the tone is negative, right? So this is largely what a good headline or a good, glimpse will have to essentially convey genre, character, and tone. Okay, great. So with that viewpoint, now let's quickly jump into our second poll question, right? So we are going to show you a list of headlines, report headlines, right? And you're going to tell me what do you find is the most interesting to explore. Okay, so these are the results, right? So ITC, another inline performance. Maruti Suzuki Limited, betting big on hybrids. SBI cards, growing NPA, a sign of worry. And RIL, talking about a Q3 update. Okay, and where do you see the maximum benefit or maximum interest? Okay, Maruti Suzuki, the tagline is very catchy, right? The headline is very catchy, betting big on hybrids, right? So hybrid is a variety, right? So the genre is basically, you're talking about, it could be a company update, or it could be a target price revision, it could be an outlook. The lead character being obviously MSIL, as well as the fact that it's product suite. And obviously, the tone is very bullish, which is about betting big on hybrids. Okay, that's interesting. Similarly, the other side, the negative side, SBI cards, the growing NPAs being a sign of worry, right? So those are pretty interesting. The RIL one, it's pretty dull, right? It just says results update, right? So that may not essentially, fuel somebody to kind of go ahead and kind of pick that up, right? So therefore, it's very important for you to have the right title, because in that list of titles that a portfolio manager or any of your investor is going to see, you're kind of literally competing with several other analysts trying to kind of present their story, right? So therefore, your glimpse, your first look, your headline, very critical. Great. So let's move to the next, right? So we've kind of now have a good sense of the glimpse. Let's move to the next. What typically gets released post a glimpse? Maybe I even blurted, I think, the term. But what exactly is what gets typically released post a glimpse, right? From a movie perspective. Introduction, okay, maybe introduction of characters. Okay. Trailer, probably, yeah, it comes at some point. There's something that gets released prior, right? And it's been there for some time now, right? Between a glimpse and a trailer, maybe. Teaser, right? So a teaser gets released, as some of you are pointing out, right? So typically, there is a teaser that comes through. Okay. Teaser, right? So no get points for guessing, right? So I'm sure you know what the movie is, right? I don't know how many of you recollect the teaser though, right? It came in 2015, Bahubali first part, right? Just 20 seconds, but it kind of gave you a sense, right? I mean, these are just shots from that teaser, right? So what do you really get out of this teaser? I mean, you have this teaser, and by and large, this was it, right? So today, probably teasers are much longer, right? So you in fact see it even for a minute, right? But I think the purpose is to kind of really keep it short and sweet, right? So this was about 20 seconds. So what does a teaser really convey about a movie? Okay, I think that's largely what's coming to how the movie is going to be. Very, 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 very well said. Okay, so in essence, if you see, right, it typically, as I said, runs for some time, so it's much bigger than a headline, right, or a glimpse. These days, although glimpse is also quite extensive, right? So it kind of, these days things are getting merged, but in essence, glimpse is supposed to just give you just one look, first look, whereas teaser is supposed to kind of be a bit more extended, right? It conveys parts of the story without really conveying the entire plot, right? So you really don't understand the plot, but these are the things which are going to kind of come and hit you. And as somebody said, it gives a sense of the context, right? So in what milieu it's kind of being set up, what's going to be the stage, right? So that kind of comes through. And the biggest purpose of why a teaser exists is to kind of literally tease you, right? It teases you to watch the movie, right? So that's the purpose of a teaser, right? So now I'm sure you're going to be familiar with what I'm going to ask. So what's the equivalent of teaser in a report, right? So we had the headline. Now what's a teaser in a report? Right. So typically reports, right? So, I mean, I think you're broadly there. So introduction, summary, right? So typically you will have an executive summary at the top, right? So which is typically just a para, right? So this is just one snapshot of a report from about RR cable. It's an initiation report. Just one para, which kind of gives you a very brief sense in terms of what it is, right? And what you observe from a length perspective, it's about 100, 150 words, typically one para. Gives you a lot of, throws a lot of metrics. It talks about the brand, strong brand. It talks about capacity expansion, distribution network, premiumization. So a lot of things it discusses, but just throws them out and kind of sets the premise, right? And you really don't know how it's going to be structured, how the story is going to come through, but you still have a sense in terms of what all can potentially come, right? And obviously, when you write, the style will have to be teasing enough, right? Somebody to kind of, it's intriguing enough to read it further, right? So that's largely what the purpose of an executive summary is, right? So somebody who reads this will have to feel, okay, there is merit here. I need to kind of go and explore this in detail, right? So that's largely the purpose of a teaser. That's largely the purpose of a executive summary, to kind of literally tell you, the broad milieu or the premise in which you're looking at the report. Great. So that's on the executive summary. Okay. Now, what comes after a teaser? I think somewhere, some of you kind of already kind of alluded to that, right? A typical teaser is followed with a trailer, right? So I'm kind of spelling it out, given the fact that some of you have already quoted that. Trailer, right? So with trailer, right? So what does that convey, right? So you have a teaser now, okay, which talks about some of the actors. It talks about the milieu. It talks about various things that happen in that movie without giving you a sense. Now, what does a trailer convey? Right? I'm sure it's much longer, right? So it's typically 2 minutes, 3 minutes. But what does that essentially look to convey? The purpose of a trailer is to, basically give you a flavor of the plot. So which means you get a sense in terms of, where the story is starting and how it's kind of going to go, right? So the structuring kind of comes through very nicely. Okay, it kind of nicely builds up to the climax, right? So obviously, without revealing the climax, you kind of build it up so that you exactly know how it's coming through. And by the end of it, right, you are in a position to say, yeah, looks to be a good trailer, you should watch this movie. Or you say, okay, not exciting enough, probably I'm not watching, right? So at the end of it, you're kind of taking that call. It sets the expectation in terms of, whether you should watch or, probably look to kind of not really watch this. So that's largely what a trailer kind of sets up. Again, an equivalent of trailer. So what's the equivalent of a trailer in a? Okay, so trailer pretty much conveys the storyline without talking about the climax. So now what? What's the equivalent there for a trailer? Okay, so basically every report, right? So when you're talking about an equity research report, typically in an initiation, and more so for some of the other cases where there's an event update or, even for that matter, a result update, typically each of them will carry something called as an investment case, right? So the investment case, typically what it does is largely details out your executive summary, right? So you would have thrown a few metrics here and there, right? But this kind of tightens that up. It kinds of exactly tells you, what are we saying in this, right? So for instance, the same RR cable, right? So what you saw is a single para. Now this, you can actually see it over a page, right? So where it talks about this typically extends to a page, as I said. The plot gets clearer because, there is a lot more of information there, quantitative validation there in terms of what each of these actually represent, right? And then it kind of, in a way, you can say it conveys the what and conceals the how, right? So which means it gives you a lot more of information, but doesn't really dwell into the details, right? It still keeps certain things, which are probably for a very serious reader aside, but largely conveys the storyline. So it sets the boundaries, it sets the expectation in terms of what to expect, really, right? So in essence, every metric that got introduced in the executive summary gets explained in detail out here. And also the context gets fully set, the expectations get built, and the boundaries get set in terms of what is it that this report is all about, right? So that largely gets conveyed in the investment argument. And if somebody is interested, it has all the hooks, which means the series reader can just go ahead and explore this in detail, right? So that's largely what the investment case does, a trailer does, right? Post which you decide whether to go for the movie, and similarly you decide whether to kind of really spend the time reading the report, right? So that's largely what the investment case does. And as we speak about this, right, so I'm sure you would have been in scenarios where, right, a movie trailer looked very interesting, but the movie failed your expectations. Similarly, vice versa, something that you thought not exciting, but the movie actually turned out to be a surprise package. So let's see, from your perspective, from your own personal experience, what has been your typical satisfaction ratio of a movie, right? So with respect to the trailer and teaser, I'm sure you have had some expectation. And when you actually watch the movie, right? So what has been your hit rate, so to speak, or satisfaction ratio, right? So if it's 60 to 80%, then it means most of these cases you've been your expectations have matched. On the other hand, if it's less than 20, which means the teaser and the trailer largely projects the best part, while it's elsewhere in the movie. Okay, so 40 to 60%, I think, which is somewhere in the middle. I think it's reasonable, right? So some movies, or literally 50% of the movies serve its purpose through its trailer and teaser, while 50% of the movies, the trailer and teaser, I think mostly it'll be a case where trailers and teasers have been positive and the movie kind of fails to meet expectation. Okay, great. Right, so this essentially takes us to the primary aspect of the movie and the report, right? So which is essentially the showtime, right? So which means movie versus the report, right? So just to kind of present that context, right? From an exposure path perspective, in the world of cinema, you start with a first look or a glimpse, then it kind of slowly moves into a teaser, trailer, and a movie. And similarly, when you're looking at it from a report perspective or a research perspective, it kind of starts with a headline and then moves into an executive summary, an investment case, and then the report. Okay. Now, I think we have kind of spent some time in terms of the first three, the headline, executive summary, and the investment case. Moving into the core, which is the report. Okay. What factors determine a report's success? Right. What makes, okay, before that, I think let's understand the movie and then we kind of bring that to the report, right? So what really makes a movie successful? Right. So if I have to kind of, convey this in a nutshell, right? So a few things, right? So playing to expectations, I think we looked at expectations, right? So if it largely meets or, it kind of exceeds expectation, that's best. If it kind of deviates, it's a problem, right? Because you've conditioned people towards a particular style, particular expectation. Okay, the other is a relatable storyline. I think story came through pretty strongly in the chat, right? So it has to be relatable. The storyline needs to be relatable, right? So that you can kind of comprehend, you can kind of, be connected with the story. Then a seamless screenplay, which means essentially, one act or one scene kind of, moving forward with the next and so on. So it has to be pretty seamless experience. Okay. And the performance, right? Needless to say, the actors will have to do their job. So they kind of really hub or, kind of level up the performance. And finally, it has to have a very convincing conclusion, right? So something which kind of leaves a good taste, right? I mean, good meaning, purposeful, right? It could be positive side, negative side, but at least the movie ending could be positive or negative, but still it leaves a very, feels convincing, right? So that's largely what, a movie success depends on. What does the report's effectiveness depend on, right? So largely relating to this. Yeah, by and large, if I have to kind of even do a, one-on-one corroboration with what we have seen, right? So don't bring any new justification, right? So once you've presented an executive summary, okay, do not start somewhere else. Do not talk about deviations. Do not bring in new metrics which have not been discussed in your investment case. Okay, not so much the executive summary, but the investment case, because you've set the boundaries there. Do not go beyond that, right? And especially don't make it an anchor, right? So something new should never bring, and critical something which where you will base your decision on something. Never ever do that with a with a new justification which is not there in your investment case, right? Observable data points, okay, and linear style of narration. Okay, what's an observable data point, right? So something where you can kind of sense check there is data to prove, right? So vague statements are always a problem, right? So you can't talk about brand value. You cannot talk about uh, product positioning, pricing power, right? Unless you're able to really quantify, showcase some data, some exhibit which kind of meets the requirement, right? So never ever just present vague statements. Always back it up with validation so that they essentially become observable metrics. And the third thing is to kind of look at very linear style of narration. Like a seamless screenplay, you need to have a very linear style of narration. And what do we mean by that? Essentially one leading to the other, we said about screenplay, right? So similarly, do not confuse your readers, your audience with moving back and forth. Let's say you're kind of valuing or you're kind of writing about a bank, right? You can't go from talking about revenues to asset quality and then coming back to cost and then maybe talking about interest rates for that matter, right? So then you're going zigzag, right, without really conveying a plot. So you will have to essentially make your narration style very, very linear, which means, I mean, you choose your own style, right? So you can talk about assets first and then move into profitability, or you might start with profitability, talk about assets later, but essentially stick to a particular order and don't keep dilly-dallying. Okay, the other very, very critical thing is around non-ambiguous anchor metric. Okay, so what do you mean by non-ambiguous anchor metric? It essentially means, do not talk of things where, you write a statement which says things are looking positive, and then the second statement says, typically, words like admittedly, nevertheless, and then you kind of introduce a negative character, negative shade, right? So then the audience is left confused as to, or the reader is left confused as to whether you are bullish or bearish, right? So the most common example that you typically see in an equity research report is talking about YOY growth and a QOQ growth, right? So quarter on quarter and year on year. Year on year growth has been bullish, has been positive. It's kind of beat expectations. Admittedly, the quarter on quarter growth turns out to be negative, right? So then you're not sure whether are you saying you buy the stock or whether you're saying don't buy, right? So avoid such ambiguous statements. Keep it to a single narrative. If it's really needed to stress on something which is on the other side, talk about it finally so that it kind of you present it as a risk rather than just for the sake of it, just presenting YOY QOQ, right? So then it completely confuses people. And last but not the least, right? So you'll have to tie up all your arguments. Don't leave anything as is, right? So you'll have to essentially tie it up to your recommendation, right? So you just can't leave it as a statement, right? Any of your arguments. So that becomes also equally critical, right? In order to make a report effective. Okay, so essentially these 5 factors, again, drawing from our movie experience, you need to ensure that a report is effective. I think 1 or 2 came through. Ending, yeah, convincing conclusion is something that we talked about. I think 1 or 2, I think somewhere I saw music, right? So somewhere, yeah, so the other factors also have a role to play. They may not essentially drive a movie's success, but essentially those are critical, right? The most critical aspect being they'll have to be in sync, right? And I've given you some screenshots. We'll discuss each one of them, but essentially the various elements that make up the movie, largely the technical side, right? So will have to be in sync, right? So apart from your storyline, apart from a convincing, lineup, you also need your various elements of the deliverables to be in sync. Okay. So from a movie perspective, okay, I think we started with music and dance. So let's maybe start there. Music and choreography, right? Music, it's critical. What equivalent for the report, right, are your exhibits. By exhibits, essentially meaning your tables, charts, input boxes. So anything that you have through which you're kind of justifying, validating whatever you're kind of conveying, right? So those largely in a way correspond to song and dance. Can you live without song and dance in a movie? Probably yes. But still, those are critical because it kind of brings credibility. It kind of extends the narration forward, and that's largely what a chart or a table does. It establishes credibility to a report because you're presenting facts, and obviously picture, when you're presenting something graphical, it's always a lot more convincing, right? So that becomes critical. And what is also more critical is, from a music and dance perspective, right? So if there is a particular mood in that movie, right, at that particular point, essentially only, so if it's a, very solid, very jubilant kind of mood, then you have a peppy number, right? If it's a, a tragedy or a sad kind of a mood, then obviously you'll have a slow number. Right? So very similarly, when you're presenting chart, very important that depending on the data, you pick the right kind of a setup, right? So if it's a time series, you go for a line or an area chart, right? So especially if there is going to be a subset involved, right? Subset of metrics involved, you go for a area chart. And if there's going to be a comparison against a benchmark, for instance, then you go for a spider chart. So you're not spending a lot of time there, but essentially the choice of the way you would present an information, right? Be it a table, be it a chart, that becomes very, very critical in terms of how effective or how powerful, how impactful you can be. Very similar to what a song and dance does. Right? Support meaning essentially your support cast. Right? So obviously the lead characters take the bulk of the load. The support artists will have to essentially play the role, right? And very similarly, you might have a couple of anchor metrics, right? So in your where you talk about things have worked well, right? So essentially your investment case will have a lot of anchor metrics. But what you also need to do is to kind of validate, revalidate with multiple other metrics, right? So because you just can't rely, let's say, on a P/E ratio and present your valuation, right? So it has to be backed either by an EV/EBITDA or you do a DCF. So either somewhere you'll have to essentially back your valuation. Very similarly on the business side, you just can't project a high revenue growth number just based on what the industry is looking at. So you'll have to look at other factors, what the company is doing, how the sector is performing, how the regulations are, and then kind of validate through multiple channels. Kind of validate and kind of add more credence, more credibility to your anchor metric, and that's largely what you need to do with the report as well. And in terms of okay, there's a good question there in terms of how do you manage personal biases, right, while choosing an exhibit. There are a couple of things. So see, one, an equity research report is largely it's not really a narration of event, but it's more I mean, it's more your opinion, right? So your opinion is what is the most valuable in your equity research report. When it comes to that, obviously your biases will play a role, right? So whether your opinion is right or wrong is a different question, because your biases can play a role, but in your report is largely a reflection of your opinion, right? So which means I think biases are okay. You can kind of bring that in. I think what is more critical from an exhibit selection perspective is whether you're presenting all elements of a data effectively through your chart, right? So if there is, you'll have to see what kind of cuts are there, right? So if there are three levels of three level dimension, right? So then accordingly, then a single bar chart or a column chart may not essentially bring it, right? So you will have to make it a stacked column, right? Even when you make it a stacked column in the numbers, you're really interested in how things have moved, right? But one could be on a slow base, I mean small base, the other could be on a bigger base. When you have variation like this, which is the third element, then you make it an 100% stacked column bar, because you're interested in the the growth, not so much the level, right? So then you kind of essentially choose exhibits in relation to what you would want to convey, right? Rather than just presenting the sake of it, a simple bar versus a stacked bar versus an 100% stack bar, which is more around proportions, right? So the choice will depend on, I think bias is okay, because, report is a reflection, as I said, of your opinion. If you're convinced about something, that's what you would write on. But what is important is whether you've captured the essence of the data fully through your exhibit. It is not just about narration or passing information, but it's about conveying a message, right? So, I mean, another good example could be just a choice of scales, right? So when you're selecting a scale, one is primary, secondary. The other could be in terms of, whether you're choosing your minimum, maximum, so that you're kind of, presenting that picture. So for instance, if you're showing market share, it's probably at best, the market share would have probably moved from, let's say 48% to about 42%, 43%. So if that is going to be the case, then if you're going to use a column chart, and let's say you're going to start from 0%, hardly going to see any change in market share, right? So you will have to then play with scale. So similarly, the choice of the chart that you pick, the choice of scaling, if you need to annotate, then accordingly kind of bring that annotation. So all of that will play a role in terms of you deciding what could be a right exhibit. Right? I hope I've answered you, Aditya. Thanks for asking that. Right. So that's around the supporting part. Okay. Next, the other critical thing from movie perspective is cinematography. I'm sure everybody agrees that, what you see, is largely thanks to how the cinematographer captures it, right? So while there could be a great storyline, there could be great performances, essentially it has to get captured and captured very effectively. Okay. And that's largely through the lens of the cinematographer. Okay. And then when it comes to report, it's largely through your writing style, right? So do not keep it very dry. Do not keep it factual. Do not keep it to the point. I mean, you keep it to the point, but do not keep it too straight, which means, simple English sentences. It has to be flowing. It has to, be exciting enough for somebody to read. You should not kind of repeat your arguments again and again, then it kind of defeats the purpose. And even choice of words, pick appropriate words, and as much as possible, do not repeat your action words, right? Because that kind of again, makes it for a dull reader, right? And data quality, right? So as much as a light, the sense of lighting is very important from a cinematography standpoint. Data quality becomes extremely important, right? So if somebody is able to rely on your data, then to that extent, you think you've presented your story very well, right? So make sure your quality of data that you're kind of presenting is also top notch. Next, editing, right? So very, very critical these days, right? So gone are the days when you had lengthy movies, lengthy reports. Okay, these days you hardly have, I mean, not hardly, but increasingly you're finding reports, moving from the conventional, 30-page, 40-page kind of style, Word document kind of style to PPTs, right? And it's only a matter of time before it evolves from PPT to probably just video cuts or shots, right? Although you have some aspects of that already in place, right? So therefore it's very important to keep it crisp, to the point, right? But keep it in a language which is interesting, engaging, impactful. I think that's largely what is needed. And whenever you're writing a report, make sure you edit it, read it a couple of times, proofread it, because that largely, right? So today people don't have time, as I said, based on the headline, they decide whether to read or not. At best, they go to the executive summary, and then large part of the reader kind of go out, which means it's very critical for you to make sure you're keeping it really, you're cutting it really good, really impactful. Okay, so that's it, editing. I think we've covered a lot of technical departments. So what next? Movie review. Okay, that's gone to the end. Okay, in terms of a movie, okay, VFX today very, very critical, right? From a setup perspective, right? You almost have no movies without visual effects, right? So, and what does a visual effect do, right? So it essentially serves two purposes. One, it gives you a surreal kind of an experience, which means things that are not there, you're able to see it, right? It's not shot, but it's actually presented in your movie screen, right? So that's something it gives. Similarly, what you need to do is you need to have sensitivity analysis, stress test as part of your write-up, right? So you just can't present fact as is and leave it there. You will have to present the risk side, typically with sensitivity analysis and stress tests. And how do you shoot, a lot of these movies today? You essentially apply a green mat right behind, where you have a green mat, you change, and which allows you to change backdrop, right? So depending on what you need, you can kind of fill it up later, right? And similarly, take that context of this particular company, place it in a bullish scenario, place it in a bearish scenario, right? So that way you keep moving around with your backdrop and see, stress test it and then kind of present the information, right? So that always is good. One, it kind of validates whatever you're talking about, and two, it also presents the risk side of things, which is also very critical for you to kind of convey in your report. Okay, and similarly, moving on, okay, the other aspects, other departments, art direction. Okay, it's about the look and feel, right? And make no mistake, look and feel extremely critical from a report perspective, right? So it's about experience. It's about what the consumer, what the reader eventually picks from the report, and it's very, very important for you to keep it very good looking. Not only from the look and feel perspective, but even simple things like typos, grammatical errors. It could be part of editing, it could be part of art direction, but essentially, making sure, because that kind of easily puts off people, right? When you find a typo or when you find the sentence structuring not great, right? So therefore, keep it the look and feel top notch, and spend good amount of time in terms of how should you go about titling it, how should you go about formatting it, and if a particular slide or if a particular page has a key takeaway message, then how do I kind of make sure that is registered, right? So should I put a blob, should I put a side comment, right? How do I kind of really make that out? Because nobody, as I said, has the time to read through, right? So which means it's important for somebody to get the message irrespective of whether they read through fully or not, right? So that becomes very critical again, right? So from the art direction perspective, that's the learning that we get, right? And last but not the least, the title cards, right, or the credits, right, that flow at the end, right? Again, very critical. So equivalent could be your table of contents, some of the descriptive things about the company, basic hygiene factors, and so on. Again, very critical. Where it helps us, because especially the TOC, it helps with conditioning the audience, right? So they exactly know what they're getting into, right? So making sure you have a very tight TOC, neither too lengthy, not too brief, but very critical, I think, for them to kind of get a good sense of what the report is. Okay, so those are the various technical departments that all needs to be in sync in order to make the movie, really successful and effective. Anything that I've missed? I think we've covered a lot of things around movie. Movie review, I think I'll park it because that's post the movie. I think it's for the uh, the consumers or the audience as well as the readers of the report to evaluate. So I'm not getting into that. Nice, giving hints of a sequel, continuation, not bad. Yeah, we can do that in a report as well, right? Yeah, but I think as they say, the premise will have to hold, right, for providing a sequel. And similarly, like in movies, the report will have to have something, right? So which is typically your catalysts, right? So the way you write, if you think there is some near-term catalysts, some regulation, some lawsuit, very recently, you had this fame, right? So with respect to passenger vehicles, right, the fame regulation coming to an end, there was a lot of suspense about whether it'll end, not end, whether it'll have an impact with electric vehicles, right? So then obviously when you're preparing a report at that point in time, you're going to have some hints for a sequel. Very true. Anything else? So essentially, kind of converging all of what we've seen over the last few minutes, right? In terms of converging it into a nutshell, right? So if I have to look from an exposure path perspective, right? So from a movie side, we talked about glimpse, teaser, trailer, and a movie. And obviously, from a report perspective, it's an headline, the executive summary, the investment case, and the report. Right? The headline, which is your first view of a report, it needs to convey the genre, and more importantly, it has to convey the tone. Right? So otherwise, it'll just fall flat, like the RAL example that we saw. The executive summary, it needs to tease with key story points, throw a few metrics, right? That gets people hooked, people interested to kind of read more in terms of why. And then the investment case, which largely sets the boundaries, sets the expectations, presents the plot in a more sequential sense, so that you kind of have a good understanding in terms of what you're kind of getting into. And finally, the report, play to the expectations, do not deviate too much, right? At the same time, make sure all the support elements are in sync, right? Do not give conflicting, confusing, ambiguous messages. Keep it, like a linear path. It has to just flow like music, right? So that it kind of nicely, at every point, it has to kind of, if you, stop at any point of the report and want to think through whether it's bullish or bearish, whether it's saying to invest, not invest, I think the message has to be clear. You just can't give conflicting messages there. Okay, I hope. Okay, and Nikita, who can publish research reports? I think that's a good question to ask. Thanks for asking, Nikita. Right. So, in terms of publishing reports, if you're talking about equity research reports, right. So, obviously, if you are a research analyst, either sitting within a sell side, right? So which means an investment bank or a broker, which is covering a set of stocks and then making recommendations on stocks. So then you're publishing. If you're on the buy side, you're still writing a report, but it's used for internal consumption. Buy side meaning your your funds, mutual funds, insurers, sovereign wealth funds. So all of them, they also kind of track companies. They also put together. There's a research unit which puts together reports, but largely used for internal consumption. And today we have independent research entities as well, IREs as they're called, which also publishes like the likes of Smart Karma, the likes of Research Exchange, where you as an individual analyst can actually go ahead, and if you think you have an interesting story to say, go ahead and publish, right? So then it's obviously the question of audience demand, right? Demand supply takes over. If an audience think that uh, right, you have a good case to present, then they're going to kind of literally purchase your report, and therefore it's a revenue generating stream. So all kind of research streams exist, but if you need to publish in your name, especially in the Indian context, as a sell side, on the sell side, you need to pass a particular certification exam, some research analyst certification, right? But otherwise, yeah, so you can still publish if it's not really from a recommendation standpoint. Yeah, so I think that's largely what we wanted to convey, right? In terms of giving you a sense of how you should look at equity research report writing, especially from its various components perspective, largely resonating with the movie world, so that from a retention perspective, from your thought process perspective, it's a lot more exciting, right? Really looking forward to kind of connecting and taking this forward with some of you. Right. Thanks a lot.